Victor ground his teeth, shedding the heavy pieces of his blistered, superheated armor to move more freely. Unleashing his brilliant blue mana, he aimed to kill Ghislain quickly and escape the shrinking ring of fire. Ghislain countered by fully igniting his three cores simultaneously, dyeing his own blade a deep, dangerous red. The shockwaves from their colliding swords blasted away the surrounding flames. Victor, a master-class warrior nurtured by Harold Desmond, possessed massive mana reserves that pushed Ghislain to his absolute limits. Despite Ghislain's superior skills, Victor's raw power and relentless textbook forms forced Ghislain to match brute strength with brute strength. They traded hundreds of lightning-fast blows, exploding the dirt beneath their feet. Soon, the immense backlash of forcing three cores to run at maximum capacity took its toll on Ghislain. His muscles tore, his bones twisted, and blood began to leak from his nose, eyes, and ears. Noticing his opponent's deteriorating condition, Victor laughed with euphoric joy, concluding that Ghislain was using a suicidal form of black magic. Shifting entirely to a defensive strategy, Victor willingly absorbed minor wounds to run down Ghislain's internal timer. As Ghislain's sword tip began to waver from severe internal damage, Victor launched a ruthless counterattack, forcing Ghislain to his knees. Spewing blood, Ghislain looked entirely defeated as Victor swung a flawless, fatal strike aimed squarely at his neck. In that final split second, Ghislain threw out his left hand. Invisible mana threads momentarily bound Victor's limbs. Though the powerful knight instantly shattered the restriction with a burst of mana, Ghislain subtly twisted his hand a half rotation further. This microscopic, secondary telekinetic distortion slightly altered the angle of Victor's downward trajectory. Boom! Victor's sword missed entirely, burying itself deep into the dirt. Before the panicked knight could pull his weapon free, Ghislain thrust his blade forward, driving the cold steel straight through Victor's neck. Squelching as he ripped the blade free, Ghislain flipped Victor's twitching body over, bleeding heavily but grinning like a madman through the agony of his ruptured cores. Ghislain looked down at the dying prodigy and promised to devour anyone else Count Desmond sent north. With a swift final downswing, Ghislain decapitated the future swordmaster, ensuring the threat was permanently buried in the ash of Ferdium. The moment he was absolutely certain of Victor's death, the immense backlash from overexerting his three cores hit Ghislain all at once, sending him collapsing to the ash-choked ground. With his Dirison armor lining completely disintegrated and his internal mana pathways fragmented, he was entirely stranded inside the blistering inferno, unable to move. Just as he accepted that his face might be covered in scars once again, Jillian sliced through the wall of flames to his rescue, sweeping him up and carrying him out into the refreshing cool air of the open plains. Outside, the mercenaries were winding down after successfully hunting down the majority of the fleeing vanguard. Soon, Lord Zwalter, Knight Commander Randolph, and a frantic Belinda arrived on horseback, having circled the blazing battlefield via the eastern gate. Belinda tearfully fussed over Ghislain's minor burns, while Zwalter embraced his son with profound, surging emotion. For the first time, Zwalter truly looked at Ghislain not as the trash of the north, but as a terrifyingly brilliant commander and the savior of their entire estate. As Randolph rallied the troops into a booming victory cheer, Zwalter joyfully suggested returning to the fortress for a grand celebratory banquet. Ghislain, however, completely shattered the festive mood with a cold, urgent declaration. We must immediately secure Count Dagold's formal surrender. When Zwalter argued that they could simply send Randolph the following day, Ghislain countered with flawless tactical foresight. If they gave Count Tamos any time to recover, scheme, or seek political protection from another territory, the geopolitical aftermath would drag on endlessly. Furthermore, Ghislain ordered his father and uncle to remain behind to handle the domestic crisis, pacify the local economy, and promise the heavily rationed civilians immediate financial compensation. To ensure Zwalter agreed, Ghislain voluntarily offered up his personal stash of runestones to completely fund the territory's recovery, conveniently keeping his father in the dark about the massive fortune he had literally detonated under the dirt hours prior. Though physically spent and running on pure grit, Ghislain refused to delegate the task. He and his mercenaries commandeered the arriving horses, bringing along Skovan, Ricardo, and the forest of beast patrol units to serve as an immediate occupying force. Before they rode out, Zwalter strictly reminded his son that despite the bloodshed, Count Diggold remained a noble ally of the royal family and deserved to be treated with proper diplomatic respect. Gislen simply offered a small, sly smile, promised not to worry him, and kicked his horse into a furious gallop toward Diggold territory to extract his final pound of flesh. Fleeing the battlefield in absolute panic, Count Thomas Diggold could not comprehend the horrific, fiery magic or the relentless black-armored forces that had annihilated his army. Realizing he was financially ruined and completely stripped of his military power, he pinned his last hopes on traditional feudal diplomacy. He knew Lord Zwalter Ferdium was a man of strict honor and customs who would never brutally murder a fellow high noble or attempt to clumsily annex an entire neighboring territory. Pushing his horse until it literally collapsed and died, Thomas rushed into his castle and ordered his terrified servants to immediately prepare for a formal surrender. He assumed he could offer a few minor baronies, squeeze his peasants for tax revenue over several years, and perhaps secure safe passage to the capital with 10 wagons of his personal wealth. His calculations proved fatally wrong. Gislen and his grim mercenaries breached the estate borders, ignoring the white flags, and marched straight into the main hall where Thomas sat arrogantly on his high throne to preserve his remaining pride. Before the Count could even finish demanding a dignified negotiation, Gislen delivered a cold, flat command. "Drag him down!" The mercenaries effortlessly yanked the screaming Count from his throne and threw him onto the stone floor. When Thomas furiously demanded a meeting with Lord Zwalter and screamed for the protection of royal law, Gislen casually took the Count's seat, crossed his legs, and informed him that he would be getting absolutely nothing. Ferdium was annexing Diggold, revoking the family title, and executing its bloodline. "Cut him down," Gislen commanded. With a single fluid arc of Gillian's massive axe, Thomas Diggold's head rolled across the floor. With the Count dead, Gislen systematically moved to secure the territory while ignoring traditional noble immunities. Mercenaries were immediately dispatched to hunt down and execute every single one of Thomas' heirs. All barons, knights, and retainers who had actively supported or funded the invasion were lined up and executed on the spot. Commoners and lower-level officials who simply ran logistics were thrown into the dungeons to be preserved for future labor, ensuring the territory's infrastructure wouldn't entirely collapse into lawlessness. During the terrifying purge, a disheveled young commoner named Lowell was dragged forward. The administrator identified him as a former scribe who had been forced to serve as Thomas' military strategy officer. Knowing he was seconds away from the axe, Lowell desperately threw himself at Gislen's feet, pleading that he was the only person capable of stabilizing the chaotic, impoverished estate. Lowell explained that because the corrupt nobles had been busy embezzling, he had single-handedly drafted the estate's laws, frugally managed its failing finances, and self-taught himself military science. Amused but skeptical, Gislen pressed him, noting that he needed people with a broad range of highly practical skills, particularly regarding commerce and the distribution of runestones. Desperate to prove his worth, Lowell boasted that he possessed flawless, rapid-fire mental calculation skills. Gislen immediately tested him with a complex mathematical equation. "Then, what's 750 times 1,920? 230, Lowell blurted out without a millisecond of hesitation. Gislen stared at him, utterly deadpan. "Not even close, is it?" "But I was fast, wasn't I?" Lowell replied. The sheer, audacious absurdity of the answer broke the tense, blood-soaked atmosphere of the execution hall. Looking down at the sweating, terrified commoner who had the sheer nerve to crack a joke to save his neck, Gislen began to chuckle. Gislen ordered Lowell to be thrown into the dungeons temporarily, keeping him alive to fully interrogate him about Diggold's administration and war preparations later. As the mercenary Gordon dragged the crying scribe away, he whispered in genuine awe, completely convinced Lowell possessed a hyper-advanced calculation style and begging the young commoner to teach him his secrets. After spending a day securing Diggold Castle's assets and resting his exhausted men, Gislen led his forces on a slow, deliberate march back to Ferdium. When the column arrived at the estate 2 days later, the atmosphere had undergone a massive, euphoric shift. The common folk rushed into the streets, showering the mercenaries and the young lord with rapturous cheers. Used to being shunned and feared as dangerous sellswords, the mercenaries puffed out their chests in pride, completely unaccustomed to being celebrated as protective heroes. Because the tactical details of the victory were classified, the civilian rumors had warped into absurd extremes, with some claiming Gislen was a secret 100-circle archmage, while others whispered he had sold his soul to a demon to gain apocalyptic powers. Watching the crowd, Gillian recalled Ghislaine's early promise to drown the estate's poverty in a torrential downpour of wealth. Realizing what he once dismissed as the arrogant boasts of a young noble was rapidly manifesting as undeniable reality. The reception grew even more staggering as they reached the inner gates of Ferdium Castle. Knight Commander Randolph had organized over 1,000 battered, battle-weary soldiers to form a magnificent, spear-saluting pathway. Behind them stood the elite knights of Ferdium, the very men who had spent years treating Gislen with utter disgust. Stepping forward in unison, the knights raised their blades to their chests and roared their glory to the heir of Ferdium, Gislen Ferdium. The highest martial salute a knight could render was offered completely voluntarily. The old labels of trash and disgrace vanished entirely, replaced by vibrant new titles from the cheering crowd, who hailed him as the true wolf of the North. In his past life as the king of mercenaries, Gislen had marched through grander, far more lavish triumph ceremonies. Yet those ancient victories had always left him hollow, drowning in isolation because his family, friends, and home had already been reduced to ash. Looking out at the disheveled, mud-stained faces of his people, the profound difference broke through his hardened exterior. Elena and Rachel were waving from the steps. Baron Homern and Albert were smiling, and Randolph looked on with absolute pride. Finally, Lord Zwalter stepped forward from the castle doors, greeting him with the warmest, brightest smile his stoic father had ever managed to give. Feeling a heavy lump form in his throat, Gislen looked at the living, breathing family he had broken the laws of time to save. Letting go of the lingering ghosts of his past life, a genuine smile spread across his face as he looked at his father and told him that he was home. Zwalter's gaze was filled with profound emotion and trust as he warmly patted Gislen on the shoulder, praising his incredible accomplishment before Omern stepped in to disperse the lingering, cheering crowd. Once inside the safety of the castle, however, the domestic reality of the situation immediately caught up with them. When Zwalter eagerly asked to see the surrender draft to calculate the incoming reparations, Gislen casually shattered his expectations by revealing that he had simply executed Count Diggold. Zwalter blinked in sheer disbelief, his expression hardening as he realized his son had completely ignored his warning to respect noble traditions. Though deeply stressed by the geopolitical nightmare his son had just handed him, Zwalter took a deep, weary breath, looked at Gislen's dust-covered face, and told him to go rest so they could discuss the fallout later. The following day, the Grand Hall was packed for the official reward ceremony, which Zwalter had to abruptly speed up after Homern's passionate opening speech began boring the audience. The common soldiers, administrative staff, and corps knights were quickly recognized, followed by Commander Randolph and Master of Arms William, who took second-class honors without a single complaint. When Gislen was finally called forward as the sole first-class merit honoree, Zwalter proudly announced a reward of 2,000 gold pieces, causing the entire hall to erupt in envious cheers. While the crowd viewed it as a staggering, life-changing fortune, Belinda, Gillian, and Kyor exchanged deeply perplexed glances, while Gislen secretly felt a wave of pity for how miserably impoverished his family's estate truly was, if 2,000 gold seemed like an astronomical sum. Once the public dispersed, leaving only the inner circle, Zwalter immediately questioned the aggressive execution of Count Diggold, pointing out that Ferdium lacked the wealth to govern an expanded, equally broke territory. Gislen countered with flawless cold logic, explaining that Diggold had been backed by outside forces like Count Rogues, meaning a living Diggold bloodline would only be used as a political puppet for a future invasion. He assured his anxious father that the legendary runestone would provide more than enough capital to stabilize both independent counties simultaneously. Though Zwalter nagged his son to show restraint before he turned the entire northern nobility into enemies, he privately felt an overwhelming sense of fatherly pride, realizing his fiercely independent son had already grown entirely beyond his grasp. Just as Gislen agreed to try his best, a sudden, horrifying realization struck Zwalter, completely erasing the lingering high of their victory. He turned to Albert to check their financial reserves, only for the treasurer to flatly remind him that they had spent every single penny on war preparations, fully intending to fund the reward ceremony using the immediate war compensations from Dickold. Realizing that delaying the payouts to the soldiers and knights would instantly destroy their hard-earned morale, Zwalter frantically looked around the room for a solution. As the awkward silence stretched on, every single vassal slowly turned their eyes toward Gislen, forcing a deeply embarrassed Zwalter to clear his throat and meekly ask his own first-class hero if he could perhaps lend the estate his runestone a bit early. To secure the desperately needed financial rescue, the vassals immediately resorted to an age-old tradition of intense, competitive flattery. Homern kicked off the praise relay by declaring that bards across the continent would sing of the young lord's historic defense, only for Albert to swiftly interrupt and add that no youth in any other estate could possibly match him. Even a reluctant Randolph chimed in with stiff approval, prompting the rest of the council to nod in unanimous, breathless agreement. Gislen basked in the thick waves of adulation until he deemed his ego sufficiently fed, at which point he casually dropped a massive bombshell by revealing that he didn't actually have any runestones left. The flattery instantly evaporated, leaving the room in a stunned, horrified silence. When a frantic Albert put the pieces together and asked if the mythical, apocalyptic fire trap used in the battle had been fueled by the stones, Gislen cheerfully confirmed that he had simply buried his entire cache underground and blown it all up like common firewood. The vassals nearly fainted at the sheer, historical absurdity of the act, realizing the young lord had effectively set fire to several massive cartloads of pure gold coins that could have comfortably sustained their impoverished territory for decades. Clutching his chest, Homern miserably wailed that the stones should have been used to buy the political favor of neighboring grand lords like Desmond, only for Gislen to bluntly counter that it was actually Marquis Desmond who had engineered the invasion in the first place. To prove his claims and ease the rising panic, Gislen signaled Gillian, who dragged in 3 battered, heavily chained knights who had been captured infiltrating the borders. Stripped of their mana by cheap suppressors and broken by captivity, the prisoners instantly confessed that they were indeed Desmond's men, sent to quietly seize Ferdium's rumored runestone wealth. The grim revelation left the council paralyzed with fear, as opposing a northern titan like Desmond was a terrifying, unwinnable prospect. Gislen took control of the room, explaining that they would play along with Desmond's superficial trick of using Dickold as a proxy to buy time, while simultaneously sending an urgent envoy to Count Rogues to solidify a defensive alliance. Watching the entire room blindly follow the young lord's flawless command, a sweating Baron Homern felt a chilling wave of anxiety, realizing that Gislen had rapidly accumulated absolute, unchallengeable power over the entire estate. With the treasury entirely empty and the immediate rewards officially delayed until a new batch of runestones could be harvested, a deeply embarrassed Zwalter pulled his son aside. Acknowledging that the promised 2,000 gold was an insulting pittance that Gislen would just end up putting right back into the estate anyway, the Lord warmly told his son to name whatever reward he truly desired. When Gislen asked about their future plans for the conquered Dickold territory, Zwalter explained he intended to govern it as a direct domain before splitting it among the loyal vassals. Gislen offered a soft, predatory smile, flashing the ruthless, transactional instincts of his past life as a mercenary leader, and casually demanded half of the entire neighboring county as his personal prize, instantly freezing the blood of everyone in the Grand Hall. Zwalter was deeply startled by the request. While granting land in lieu of depleted funds was a standard feudal alternative, demanding half of an entire county was an astronomical ask. Before the council could process the shock, 2 mercenaries shoved open the hall doors and unfurled a map, proving Gislen had meticulously planned the entire maneuver. Pointing to the southern and eastern borderlands of Diggle County, Ghislain explicitly declared his intention to annex 3 specific baronies under the single mantle of Fenris territory. When Zwalter questioned the logic behind claiming these precise frontline regions, Ghislain explained that he intended to raise a formal, permanent army on the border to secure a strategic flank against the inevitably hostile Grand Lordship of Raypold, recognizing that relying solely on sellswords had structural limitations. Though Walter worried about the staggering administrative burden of reviving a war-torn territory without an established knightly order, he ultimately relented, recognizing his son's boundless ambition and the pragmatic benefit of giving the future heir early governing experience. The vassals let out weary, defeated sighs, completely aware that arguing against the keeper of the runestones would only make them look foolish. One by one, Homern, Albert, and Commander Randolph threw their weight behind the proposal, noting that leaving the vulnerable southern borders to a heavily funded, combat-proven commander was a perfect shield for Ferdium while they focused on domestic recovery. With the council's unanimous, if somewhat dazed approval secured, Zwalter bypassed the tedious delay of a royal court schedule, drew his ceremonial blade, and conducted a rushed, informal ceremony on the spot, officially dubbing his son Baron Fenris. Ghislain offered only a half-hearted transactional response to his father's solemn feudal oaths, eagerly cutting the ceremony short the moment he legally secured the title. Stepping out into the castle corridors where a massive crowd of servants, soldiers, and mercenaries had gathered, he was instantly swarmed by his cheering men. Belinda proudly bounced around, taking comedic credit for the young master's early education, which prompted a snide remark from Kyor and nearly sparked a bloody brawl between the two lieutenants until Jillian stepped in to separate them. Watching his people look at him with genuine admiration, rather than the historic disgust he was so used to, Ghislain felt a fleeting, bitter wave of regret for how easy earning their love could have been in his past life if he had simply stepped up sooner. Shaking off the momentary melancholy, Ghislain instantly plastered a smug, theatrical smile across his face and loudly announced to the entire castle that the newly appointed Baron was personally funding an all-you-can-eat victory feast. The corridors erupted into ecstatic cheers, the joyous shouts of "Long live Baron Fenris!" echoing deep into the grand hall where the exhausted vassals could only shake their heads in wry amusement. Leading the rowdy, roaring procession out toward the courtyard, the young lord officially embraced his new sovereign title, setting a trajectory that would soon echo far beyond the borders of the north. Back in the heart of Desmond territory, Count Harold was in a state of apocalyptic fury. Looking at the badly burned, trembling survivors of his vanguard, he slammed his fist down so hard his desk shattered into splinters. The notion that the finest army in the north had been utterly annihilated by an impoverished backwater like Ferdium was a humiliating impossibility. To make matters worse, the elite magic engineers were gone, and his painstakingly nurtured prize knight Victor was officially missing and presumed dead. Gazing at the terrifyingly unpredictable tactical maneuvers of Ferdium's black unit in the written reports, Harold realized this was no fluke, but the sheer magnitude of the fire trap baffled him, as not even the kingdom's 2 seventh-circle mages could replicate such destruction. Sensing the icy, murderous aura of their commander, Harold's advisors cowered, realizing that the ruthlessly cruel Duke of Dauphine and his mysterious, kingdom-overthrowing backers would not tolerate such a massive blunder. Harold suppressed his rage and pivoted. Knowing Count Raypole would soon try to exploit Desmond's weakened state, Harold issued a cold, desperate command to his terrified council: accelerate Lady Amelia's internal Raypole rebellion immediately to force a shift in the northern balance of power. Meanwhile, a safe distance away, Lady Amelia was lazily passing the time inside her carriage, teasing her cat Bastet with a stalk of grass while blocking the passage to Ferdium. The peaceful monotony shattered when Bernarf brought in her haggard, filthy spies bearing a chaotic battlefield report. As the scouts frantically described the apocalyptic fire that swallowed thousands of Desmond's troops, Bernarf noted that such magic would require a mythic 8th circle wizard like the Guardian of the World Tree. Amelia, however, let out a sharp, satisfied chuckle. Thinking outside the bounds of ordinary logic, she instantly deduced the truth. The lunatic, Gislin, had buried decades' worth of Ferdium's runestone reserves underground just to use them as volatile firewood. While Bernarf reeled at the sheer financial absurdity of setting fire to literal cartloads of gold, Amelia felt a chilling respect for Gislin's terrifyingly swift troop management. Recognizing the geopolitical domino effect of Desmond's defeat, she instantly ordered Bernarf to mobilize their hidden forces. She predicted that her greedy father, Count Rapold, would use the defense of their ally Ferdium as a hollow pretext to march on a weakened Desmond. In response, Harold would be forced to trigger Amelia's coup prematurely to survive. Though frustrated that the accelerated civil war would leave her with a damaged, war-torn Rapold domain, Amelia looked out the window with an icy, calculating glare. Acknowledging that Gislin was a wretched, formidable bastard who had successfully bought himself time, she pushed aside her personal grudge for the moment, resolving to claim her own crown first before inevitably crushing him the moment he let his guard down. Slipstreamed away from the rowdy victory banquet, Gislin quietly bypassed the celebrations to personally visit the grieving families of the fallen soldiers. Recognizing his personal role in escalating the conflict to protect the territory, he held their hands, offered profound condolences, and promised substantial financial compensation, earning the deep gratitude of the emotional citizens. Gillian observed this with newfound respect, realizing the young commander cared deeply for his people, far beyond mere cold efficiency. A tearful Belinda, who viewed the local soldiers as friends, accepted a handkerchief from Gislin before they headed back to the castle to check on the wounded. Visiting the infirmary, Gislin warmly praised a recovering Vanessa, who beamed with pride at finally being validated as a true mage. This prompted a weak, disgruntled complaint from Alfoy, who was still panting from near-fatal mana exhaustion. Alfoy demanded to know how Vanessa had managed to channel high-level magic without even sensing mana prior to the battle. But Gislin merely smirked, telling the desperate mage he would share his secrets only if Alfoy worked hard for the estate. When Alfoy threatened to return to the magic tower, Gislin cheerfully countered that he was planning a visit there himself and would gladly put in a good word with the tower master, leaving the sputtering mage behind as he told Vanessa to rest. The next day, Gislin led his mercenaries back into the Forest of Beasts to harvest a massive new cache of runestones, handing half over to Baron Homern to completely stabilize Ferdium's depleted treasury. Knowing the enemy was too broken to launch an immediate counterattack, Gislin refused to rest and resolved to quickly build up his funds, military strength, and alliances before taking formal control of his new barony. Instructing Kaior and a detachment of mercenaries to temporarily secure the Fenris estate, Gislin turned his horse around and rode directly toward the Crimson Flame Tower, accompanied by Belinda and Gillian. Upon arriving at the pristine Tower City, the previously stiff gatekeepers and the receptionist Sylvan welcomed Gislin with obsequious deference, immediately escorting him to the Tower Master. Hubert greeted the young noble with theatrical anxiety, eager for details on the Northern War he had been tracking through his own private channels. Gislin leisurely sipped his tea before casually dropping the bombshell that he had won by burying his entire fortune of runestones underground and detonating them. Hubert shrieked in absolute horror at the sheer madness of wasting such a vast, astronomical treasure, lamenting that the tower would have gladly sent a battalion of battle mages to help if Gislin had simply traded the stones to them instead. Playing along with Hubert's empty, post-war flattery, Gislin flashed a smooth, serpent-like smile and praised the Tower Master's newfound honor and generosity. Hubert felt a cold wave of psychological unease wash over him, suddenly remembering how expensive Gislin's conversations tended to be. His instincts were proven entirely correct when Gislin flashed a broad predator grin, noting how glad he was that they were on the same page, before delivering a devastating blow. He would no longer be able to sell a single runestone to the Crimson Flame Tower. Hubert practically threw a tantrum at the suggestion that the runestone sales were off, fiercely arguing that the tower had already sent mages and offered to pay triple the market price to secure the supply. Gislin let out a heavy, calculated sigh, painting himself as a victim of circumstances, and pointing out that the recent invasion proved more northern lords would inevitably target Ferdium. When Hubert frantically offered to pay an unprecedented 5 times the market price, Gislin casually shot him down, explaining that raw gold couldn't instantly materialize trained soldiers or defenses. He spun a dark, hypothetical web, casually informing the horrified Tower Master that without an established army, his only logical recourse during the next invasion would be to bury his remaining runestones underground and detonate them all over again to survive. Hubert's vision blurred with sheer financial despair at the thought of more mythic wealth being vaporized as volatile firewood, but he found himself utterly trapped by Gislin's brutal, unassailable logic. Sensing the old man was completely cornered, Gislin feigned deep regret and rejected Hubert's desperate, frantic suggestions of seeking royal protection or swearing fealty to the Duke of Delphin, subtly steering the conversation exactly where he wanted it. When a sweating Hubert finally declared that the Crimson Flame Tower would openly dispatch a battalion of powerful battle mages to protect the territory, Gislin quickly covered his mouth to hide a triumphant smirk. He smoothly stoked Hubert's rising paranoia, subtly implying that merely sending unmarked mages risked exposing the tower to massive political scandal if they were discovered on a secular battlefield. Before Hubert could descend into total panic, Gislin offered a brilliant, unprecedented loophole. The Crimson Flame Tower needed to officially establish a permanent branch within his domain to provide legitimate legal cover for the mage's presence. Hubert gasped in disbelief, flatly protesting that no magic tower in continental history had ever shattered its sacred neutrality by planting a branch inside a noble's political territory. Gislin countered with fluid, dangerous pragmatism, pointing out that ancient unwritten rules would mean nothing if the tower collapsed from a lack of runestones. Recognizing that Gislin was a visionary beast completely unshackled by tradition, Hubert broke under the pressure, realizing his elders would gladly embrace the shamelessness of a branch if it guaranteed a direct monopoly on the legendary stones. With the deal struck, Gislin relaxed, knowing he had successfully swindled a continuous supply of elite magical artillery without wasting a single precious hour trying to train mages himself. As a proud Hubert began listing strict, non-negotiable requirements for the new branch, demanding spacious, scenic, and highly fertile land to maintain the prestigious pride of the tower, Gislin nodded in pleasant agreement before tossing a final curveball, stating the branch would not be located in Ferdium. When a thoroughly bewildered Hubert demanded to know where they were supposed to go, Gislin flashed a brilliant, predatory smile and instructed him to pack their bags for the newly conquered barony of Fenris. Hubert's face instantly drained of all color, terrified by the sudden realization that this unpredictable, tradition-smashing lunatic was now a sovereign lord with his very own territory.